Hello everybody, this is 10-minute openings, series and video number 1, Sicilian Defense, Dragon Variation, or rather Accelerated Dragon Variation. Of course, it's pretty hard to consider an opening with all the depth in just one video, especially in 10 minutes, but we are going to cover it so that you can more or less play it already in your games. For just 10 minutes, I think that's a pretty good deal. So let's jump right into it. We are going to be responding to e4 with c5. Now, what we need to know in this is, of course, white is first of all going to go with knight f3. We have to be ready for that because a lot of players, they play, the Italian games, and if you play the Sicilian, they might still respond the same way. Now, we play knight c6. So if they still go with the Italian way of playing this, we're just going to respond with g6. This is what's called the dragonish setup here because we put the bishop on g7. That is what identifies the dragon here in chess positions. Now, if our opponent goes knight g5, just like in some fried liver, then we'll go e6, just defending the pawn on f7. And here many people actually blunder by playing queen f3, threatening the checkmate on f7, instead blundering their knight on g5. So that's good for us. Just don't blunder your queen later on because the bishop is pointing here. So whenever the pawn pushes here, you can either take the bishop, or let's say after castles here, if they do this, just drop your queen back here. Or you can even drop it back immediately here if you don't want to get it lost. So now, if they just develop normally in this position without jumping over with the knight to g5, let's say they castle, right? Then we'll play bishop g7. If they continue normal development, we'll play, let's say, e6 here, knight e7, and that is our development. Then we're going to get castled very soon. Now, keep in mind that there is actually a small trap in this position. If white plays bishop e3, we can actually win a piece, so perhaps that's going to be useful for you. After d5, we hit the bishop, pawn takes, the bishop has to move back, and then d4. We win a piece here. Just after that, you need to convert this advantage into an actual point, but that's a different story. Now, you can also develop the knight to f6, but keep in mind that some pawn push to e5 is sometimes annoying, so sometimes you just want to play d6 just to stop that, and then next you can play knight f6 and castle short, actually. So that is if your opponent plays into this Italian setup. Now, if your opponent plays into the Spanish setup, or in this case it is the Rossolimo that is played with bishop b5. Well, we do the same thing. We'll play g6, and if they actually take this knight, which they do oftentimes, we can take back both pawns, but let's just say towards the center. Castles and bishop g7. If they ever go d4, we're happy, we will just take, knight takes d4, and perhaps even c5 next, and we have a pretty decent position. And if they don't push the pawn, they go here, well, you can either play d6 here and then develop normally. Sometimes you put the pawn on e5 and develop your knight to e7. Sometimes you actually even develop your knight here and try to put it on f7. So you try to develop in a normal manner after that, or you can even start with knight f6. And if the pawn pushes here, you have the d5 square that is accessible. So black gets a fine position. Of course, it can be played at the top level, and maybe somewhere white gets a small advantage, but overall you're fine. It's just a positional game. You don't get attacked from the start, you don't lose the game from the start, and you just have a normal position in the middle game. Now, if our opponent plays into the main setup, which is the central break d4, of course, this is going to be, the most testing one. So here we will take with the pawn, knight takes, and then we will play, we don't take again, we'll just play g6, just this dragony setup that we discussed. Now, white plays, let's say, knight c3 here. If white ever takes your knight on c6, because right now you're actually threatening to win white's knight on d4. We have two attackers on it, remember. So if white ever takes on c6, we'll take with the b pawn towards the center. And then if they play bishop to c4, then again, if you develop the knight immediately, then after e5, it might be a little bit, uncomfortable. So what you want to do is first you want to prevent the pawn push. So you can play d6, and then after castles, let's say knight f6 here, that's okay. Or you can also play queen to c7, and after queen c7, if they castle here, then you can play knight f6 so that they cannot push the pawn to e5. And next you can castle, later on you can play d6, and you have a fine position. Now, if they don't take on c6, which is stronger, if they play bishop e3, then we'll play knight f6, and now there is actually a couple traps for white to avoid. First of all, if white tries to castle long and they play queen d2, we castle short and they castle long, this is bad for white because we can play knight g4. Remember this move, it's a very important point of the video, because we are going after this dark squared bishop, of course. And if, let's say, white, if white moves it away, then we can actually steal this knight for free, perhaps this way, or bishop takes d4, which is, it's good for black. If they take our knight first, and let's say they play bishop d4 to try and trade off the bishops, we actually have a pretty nice way to win a game here. We can play bishop h6, and if they try to block this pin with f4, then, well, we can play e5 suddenly. And after the bishop moves back to e3, because if he takes with the pawn, then we'll take the queen, and if he takes with the bishop, well, we'll take the bishop, because if they take, we'll take the queen. So if they drop the bishop back here, we can take it, queen takes, and we can win the queen. That's good for black, obviously just winning. Of course, that's nice. So let's just say white doesn't want to allow knight g4, which happens if the queen moves away. Yeah, castle, castle, knight g4, as we just saw. And white plays f3 first to prevent knight g4. Sure, we'll castle. And then if white plays queen d2 now, we cannot play knight g4. Well, that is true, but we can actually play d5, the other magic trick that we have here, because after d5, if we can do it, we always want to do it, because we break the center, we open the bishop from g7, we open the queen on the d file, and let's just say they take on c6, we'll take here, they take here, we take this way. Now we have rook b8, queen to c7, all aiming at the queen side. If white ever castles long, they get in a lot of trouble here. So black is doing very well. Also, we have a fantastic center, so black is definitely better. So finally, if white plays bishop to c4, after, let's say, he played f3, castles, bishop c4. Well, in this position, only in this position, we have a very nice trick. That is, if they played this f3 move and weakened the bishop on e3 and it's not defended, we play queen b6, only in this position. Because this way we're aiming at the pawn and at the bishop on e3. So if white decides to defend that with, let's say, bishop b3, a lot of people defend the pawn on b2, then we have this very nice hit in the center with knight takes e4. Because if they take this knight back, then we'll just take the knight, and we want a pawn on that. And, well, the move knight to d5, attacking our queen, actually gives white equality after queen a5, c3, and we can drop the knight back one of these squares. But you're unlikely to see this, because if people blunder this idea with knight takes e4, they're unlikely to find knight d5. Also, they will be really shocked after you play knight takes e4, so don't worry about that. You will have at least a psychological advantage, even if they find all that they found, so they might not understand that the position is actually equal. They might still feel like they're under pressure. So, this is not a good line. The best line for white is to play bishop c4 after knight f6, castle, bishop b3. And in that case, you just play d6, open up the bishop, and you want to play knight g4, and if they play f3, you can play bishop d7, later on trade off the knights, and then launch the pawns on the queen side. White will try to attack on the king side, so we have a pretty double-edged position with, you know, mutual play. So black is doing okay. Now, going back to the original position, there's just a couple deviations we have to see. First of all, the Alapin Sicilian. If white plays c3, the Alapin Sicilian, we'll just play knight f6. Beware that we cannot play knight c6, it's not a good move here, so we'll play knight f6, using the fact that white cannot play knight c3 to defend the pawn. And now if the pawn pushes, which is really the only way to contest this line, knight d5, d4 will just take. If they take back, we will try to undermine the center as early as possible. And if they do this, we'll just do this. If they ever take the pawn, of course, you should take with the queen, so that white ends up with an isolated pawn and you don't. Now, if they don't take, well, you can take yourself, or you can develop normally with e6, bishop e7, and so forth, castles, and black has a fine position. And the last deviation that we have to see is the closed Sicilian. So the closed Sicilian happens after knight c3, knight c6, and let's just say f4 or g3, one of these moves. Our setup is really going to be the same. We play g6, knight f3, bishop g7, and here white can choose where he wants to put this bishop. It can be either c4 or g2. Well, if white chooses to put the bishop on c4, we play e6, let's say d3, knight a7, and if they ever push f5, we can just take. So far, it's no big deal. It's an okay position for black. But if white doesn't want to push f5, let's say he castles, then we will actually insert the d5 move. If they take, we're always very happy to open up the bishop and ruin the central structure for white. But if they drop the bishop back to b3, we will just get castled, and later on we use the plan of launching the pawns on the queen side. Rook b8, b5, a5, a4, b4, trying to move up the pawns here. Now, if they do bishop to g3 instead, we are going to do the same thing. e6, knight e7, castles, d6, and rook b8, b5, a5, b4, trying to launch the pawns here. That is almost it. The only thing is that in this position they can also play bishop b5 to attack the knight on c6, but well, if you're already developed like this, then it's not the Rossolimo exactly, so you can actually play knight d4, and you want to take this bishop out. If they take, you can take with the pawn, and black has a normal position as well. that is about it on the Sicilian, overall on the Dragon Sicilian. So hopefully you've enjoyed this series. We had to be quick because it's 10 minutes, but you can come in later and, you know, rewatch this one. So hopefully you enjoyed this one. My name is Matvey Galchenko. I am an international master. Consider subscribing to the channel because there will be more videos of this kind on various openings. Let me know which openings you want to see. And thank you guys for being here, for watching. Make sure to like this video as well, and I'll see you guys in the next one. So take care. Peace.